Hi, can everybody hear me? Right. Now that Paul has whetted your appetite, you might well be asking yourselves, well, where do I start? I've got a languages degree, or I've got a law degree, and I'm a fluent speaker of French or German or Italian. So where do I start? So I'm going to try to answer some of these questions that you might be asking yourself. So you've got good language skills, you want to be able to use them in your work, and you're thinking that you might like to train to work in translation and or interpreting. Now I have to confess that I myself, seeing as Paul gave you a fairly personal view, I might try and do the same. I myself started out as a translator even longer ago than Paul did, and at that time there were very few training courses available. I think there was about one in the country, which only took about 6 people a year. So it was really hard to actually get on a course, and most translators learnt by actually job shadowing, by getting a job as a junior translator and being trained on the job working with colleagues. However, in terms of the time required to get up to the level, it was a much slower way of doing it, which is why I would recommend everybody nowadays to do a course. Before I do this, when I prepared the slides, I wasn't clear exactly what Paul was going to say, so some of my slides will be reinforcing Paul's message, but I think it's probably not a bad thing, because if you hear it twice, even if you hear it 3 times from another speaker, you're probably more likely to remember these details. And I've got a slightly different take on things as well. So translators and subtitlers, for both these kinds of work, you would need a love of research, you need attention to detail. So this is about being really thorough, as Paul called it. And you need to be able to write well. And you need to like writing. You know, people have said to me, well, I want to be a translator. I don't really like writing. Well, if you don't like writing, you have to actually try to encourage yourself to like it, because otherwise you're not going to enjoy the job. Interpreters. I think interpreters need a very quick brain. I've done very little interpreting. I did used to do it for social services in the 1980s. They had a lot of refugees from Zaire, I think it was, and they did use French. They'd used French as their official language during their education and so on, so I had to interpret for them. And I found it very taxing, and my conclusion was that you needed a very quick brain, excellent communication skills, a good memory, and the ability to stay focused. If the discussion that's going on doesn't really interest you, you still have to actually be able to concentrate on it. And if you're the sort of person who can't stop yourself switching off when the topic of discussion isn't really your thing, then maybe interpreting isn't really for you. Maybe translation is more for you. Other careers in translation, I've mentioned subtitling. I'd also like to mention project management. Project management is a very popular career path that's followed by a lot of our graduates from the MA program. It is an interesting job. You need to be a good business person, a good business communicator. You need to have communication skills, because you liaise both with clients and with translators. You need to be well organized. You need to have good IT skills. Project managers often have to work with things called dongles, you know, sort of little gizmos that are provided by a client with a memory for a particular translation project. And maybe that memory is something that they don't want to have in the public domain, so it would be on a special sort of dongle. And so you have to know how to sort of work with the very sort of more sophisticated aspects of translation software, CAT tools, and managing CAT tools, and actually trying to synchronize things like done by different translators. I think project managers probably, from what I've heard, also need patience and a sense of humour. I've been at the receiving end of the sort of very patient team in a big German company that I sort of do freelance translation work for, and they're always very friendly, very patient, very understanding, terribly grateful that you can translate over 10,000 words within a week for them. And so if you're that sort of person, project management, and you're sort of a people person, that could be an alternative career path for you. So how do you acquire these skills? There are lots of different courses available. The University of Westminster offers MA courses in both translation and interpreting. We have a combined course in both, and we have individual courses in translation and also a separate course in conference interpreting. Other universities have similar courses all over the country, so there's plenty out there for you to choose from. There are a small number now of BA degrees in translation. We've recently started one here. The BA course is not really intended for people to go straight out there and become a translator or interpreter. It is actually intended to give somebody a good foundation, to teach them the linguistic basics, but with a view to then going on, doing a further degree and really specialising in the professional skills that they need. So if you do a BA, don't think of it as a shortcut. It's not. It's really intended to help you to get the right basics to then go on for further study. Master's courses will vary. The courses that we offer here are all practical. A number of other universities across the country offer courses that usually have a label that's something like Masters in Translation Studies. This kind of course is much more academic. So if you're thinking, I want to teach in a university, I don't necessarily want to be a translator, but I want to sort of theorize on translation and really be an academic, maybe translation studies are for you. But most practical translators find something like, we have technical and specialized translation here. We also have bilingual translation if people are not native speakers of English. This kind of course, or conference interpreting course, is much more practice-based. So, if you don't have a first degree, does it mean you can't do a master's? Not necessarily. If you have, say you don't have a first degree in languages and you've qualified as a solicitor, for example, you may not actually have a law degree, you may be an older person who qualified as a solicitor by the old sort of route, and if you don't have a first degree but you have experience of working with languages and you have 3 or 4 years of really good, sound practical experience, plus a lot of life experience and another professional sort of qualification or professional experience, you could convince an admissions tutor to allow you on to a master's course if you pass the translation tests. You would have to do translation tests anyway. So not having a first degree wouldn't necessarily mean that you couldn't do a master's. If you're a mature applicant, that means over 25, at least. So a lot of you here would qualify as mature, I guess. So if you have several years of professional experience, the translation tests that we set are reasonably taxing. They're intended just to show whether you've got an aptitude for translation. So other options, if you think that you haven't got the time or possibly you haven't got the financial backing to be able to embark on a master's, which could cost you, probably the tuition fees and so on would be about £4,000, just under that, for a one-year course. You could do it part-time, which would then cost you about £2,000 a year. If you think that you perhaps don't have the finance or the time to do that, you could consider other options, such as the Chartered Institute of Linguists qualifications. They offer the Diploma in Translation, known as the DipTrans. That's the route by which I myself qualified. Now, the DipTrans is a diabolically difficult exam. I prepare students for that course in French in an evening class, and it is very difficult to obtain a pass in all three papers in one go. A lot of candidates actually need 2 or 3 years to obtain that qualification. If you are an absolutely brilliant translator with a lot of experience and you don't have a paper qualification, you might find that is a good route for you, but it isn't an easy route. If you took an evening class, it would probably cost you, I can't remember exactly how much our evening classes cost now for that, or I think it's usually perhaps about £600 something a year, plus around the same amount of money for the exam. You'd need to look on the Institute of Linguists website to get the exact figures, but so it would be cheaper assuming you passed first go. But most people don't, so then they'd have to pay exam fees again, and they might want to do another course. So it's not necessarily cheaper in the long run unless you have a lot of experience. The main reason for doing that is that people might have young children and can't actually come to a daytime course, or it might be that they're working full-time and they want to do this in the evenings. But it's not necessarily an easy option. If you want to qualify as a community interpreter, which my colleague Christine Adams will be telling you about this afternoon, I think, you can look to doing the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting, which is, it's intended for people who perhaps are bilingual, who have been asked to translate for doctors' surgeries, for hospitals and so on, or even in a court, a police station situation, and actually want a qualification to prove that they know how to do the job, and also want to know how to do the job more effectively and more professionally. So that's another option, and various courses are available. I don't think we actually offer that here, but other places in London do. Both the Diploma in Translation and the DIPSI are open to non-graduates, which is an important point. You used to have a first degree to do the DipTrans. I remember having to sign letters for the Institute of Linguists for students who didn't have one to say that actually they were of degree standard and could they be exempted. But now it's up to you. Candidates for the Diploma in Translation are actually self-selected. Some of them, I think that they perhaps are of the right level when they're not, and so the pass rate for the DipTrans is not terribly high. It's about 40%, I think, on average, which is not terribly high. It's a very tough exam. As I said before, they don't have to have a first degree to get these qualifications, but they have to be extremely professional, and a high level of professionalism is important. So if you decide to do a master's, what will you study? You'll study core modules in translation and interpreting. You'll usually do 1 or 2 languages and specialist areas, such as technical, medical, or economic, institutional, and legal. If you study at this university, you have to do 2 special areas, and you don't actually have a choice. you just do technical and institutional. Other universities, I used to teach at Surrey, and I know there they do give people some choice in what I think they there had 3 options. They used to have a legal option, which was separate from the business, the economics option. But not all universities do that. You'll also, in most courses, do just a little, but not too much, translation theory. And the final thing is you do, to get a master's level qualification, rather than just a diploma, you could leave the course after you got the diploma. You pass your final exams, you had a diploma, you could then leave. But most people want to go on and actually have the master's. For that, they have to do a research thesis or a long translation project. It sounds daunting, but it's not really, because the translations they do are about 8,000 words on average, and then they write a commentary of about another 4,000. It's 6 to 8, I think, is normally what we say, and then about 4,000 for the commentary. Most translators would easily translate that in a week. Our students have 4 months in which to do it, so we're quite generous, really, I think. And most universities do a similar project. They have a similar setup. You can also do a more academic thesis. I know Philippe, who's coming to talk to you later, he chose the thesis route, and if you wanted to know more about that, I'm sure Philippe could tell you a little when he gets here. So why should you take a course? Well, you will learn professional skills. You'll improve your employability prospects. You'll become aware of current practice, of the professional etiquette, the conventions that, translators will say, well, in the UK, professionals, as Paul mentioned, wouldn't normally if you're an English native speaker, you wouldn't translate into French. You'd translate out of French, out of German, out of Spanish, out of Italian, out of Russian, out of Polish. If you would only translate into those languages if they were your mother tongue. So this is the sort of current practice. In other countries, the practices vary. So again, if you're working in Switzerland, you would need to know what the practice is there, for example. I did work in Geneva, and there were translators working at a very high level, doing very technical texts from German into English, and one lady was actually Brazilian, but it's not what we do here. To acquire specialist knowledge is another reason for taking a course, so that you learn about legal texts, you learn the kind of formulas that you would find in a legal text. You learn about sort of bonds and shares and all this kind of things. And you learn a little bit of medical, a little bit of technical. Then you know where you're going to specialize. So can you still hear me? I'm not too loud or too quiet? Is that okay? Yeah? Option modules that you would study on a master's would include things like editing skills. CAT, which is computer-assisted translation, you'd learn how to use Trados and similar tools. You'd also learn a little bit about machine translation, about systrans and things like that. You might choose to do text analysis, which we call by the rather grand name of discourse analysis. You might learn other languages. This year, at this university, we piloted a course in Romanian into English translation. Now, this was the first time Stella was very much involved with this, and it's been very successful. And it means that students have got something that they can offer on their CV, which is very much out of the ordinary. You might learn principles of economics and finance, or principles of science and technology, which again is very useful, because unless you've done these things at university, you might find them very challenging in a translation. But these courses are intended to give people that knowledge. Subtitling, that's mainly for people who are translating out of English because there's no market or very limited market into English. You might do an option module on the EU. That's something that the interpreters on the conference interpreting course all have to do as a compulsory core module. Translators have to do it, don't have to do it, but some of them choose to. Translation theory is something else that some people really like and they want to do in more detail, and it helps them with their master's project. So that's another option you can do. So to recap a little bit, what are the advantages of this training? It helps you to become a really confident and effective professional. It helps you to find work more easily because having the masters, knowing what you're talking about, having networked with people, it all helps. A knowledge of the workplace, as I mentioned earlier, and of professional etiquette is also really useful. You won't step on anybody's toes or break any unspoken rules. You'll know a little bit about legal issues, about contracts. You'll make sure that people don't exploit you. And this can happen. You know, some websites on the internet offering translation where you sort of bid and this kind of thing, you have to know how to negotiate them and how to deal with that. Networking and peer support, I think, is also really important. And by doing a course, you immediately have your peer group that studied with you, and it's very helpful to continue to be in contact with these people and also with your tutors. And knowing how to use resources. This is one key aspect of training. The other thing, which is not on my slide, which I'd like to add, is you get there much more quickly. If you follow a course, you will learn in a year what it took me at least 5 years probably to learn. I learned by my mistakes, which in this current sort of economic climate, employers would be reluctant to let people do. So you're not expected to make any mistakes to start with. I mean, I was lucky that I grew up in a different era when you could make mistakes and you had senior colleagues who would go through your work and who would put you right before it went to the department that had commissioned it. We also used to have to liaise a lot with scientists and so on who taught us the basics that I didn't know, having done a languages degree and so on. But doing a course like this, you start at a much higher level, and it's much better from the employer's point of view and from your point of view, as you won't end up with egg on your face, as it were. So I talked about resources. The sort of resources that you'd learn to use are translation tools, dictionaries and glossaries, many of which are now online, reference works, online resources, professional associations, language networks within the ITI. There are loads of networks. Some are language-based, some are subject-based, and some are local, like I belong to the London Regional Group. I also belong to the French and German networks, and that's really useful. There are also continuing professional development, CPD as we call it, events organised through the ITI, organised by universities. Some are organised by professional associations. If you do medical translation, you might be able to get yourself along to some kind of conference within that field, for example, which could be quite useful. I actually attended a nursing conference a few months ago with my daughter, but I didn't actually get to hear any of the lectures because I was there as babysitter. But just sort of looking at the different schedules of what people were going to be talking about and so on just gives you an idea of what goes on in other professional fields that you might be translating about. So it's all useful. So to recap the career options again, you probably get sick of hearing this by the end of the day, but just to reinforce the message, if you've gone for a course in interpreting, if you've done the DIPSI route, you would probably be working within the community, for the police, in courts, in hospitals. You could be working in businesses, one-to-one liaison with clients or with larger groups. You could be working in local, central government, in international organisations, which obviously is the creme de la creme, and at conferences. A lot of this work would be freelance. If you were a conference interpreter, some of what you would do might be freelance, but you'll be told more about this by the interpreters later on today. Certainly a lot of the community interpreters I know are freelance. Translation. An in-house translator, as Paul mentioned, freelance translator, project manager. Another career is a terminologist, a subtitler, or a specialist in translation tools. I had somebody in one of my DipTrans evening classes who has a very good job managing a company in Woking that specialises in translation tools and in very large projects. And so if you're a real IT buff and a good linguist and you do a translation qualification, you could still go into that kind of career route. Other training available, well, I mentioned the ITI events. There's also online mentoring available through the ITI, which is really useful. And at this point, I'd also like to mention something, an initiative of Stella's. She's standing over there. So if you want to know more about this, you can ask Stella. Stella is in the process of setting up some online CPD modules in translation. This will not actually train you to be a translator as such, but it will give you a lot of the background. So if you want to know more about that, it's still sort of at a pilot stage, but Stella will be able to tell you. Other training, go to as many workshops, courses, seminars and conferences as you can. Network, it will help you to get career contacts, get possible translation jobs and so on. There's university events. That's about it, really.